in little secret messages that you exchange through handshakes on the street of Cambridge. But usually it's the first one. Actually, that second one's never happened. But if you want to send me a message that way, we can try. Um, so I think we have one question from Ettore, which I'll answer briefly, and then in the absence of questions, we usually just riff about things that often Carlos has some provocative topic. So I think Ettore was asking us about this thing that's called observer theory and further developments on observer theory. And just to answer Ettore, we haven't really been working on observer theory. That's something in which Stephen takes a particular interest, but I think that you can probably expect to see some developments in the coming weeks on that front. So if you're interested in that, you can stay tuned. And I think a good contact person for that will probably be Nick. I imagine Nick will in some way be closely involved in that. Well, that was an easy question to answer. And I think that was the only question. So, Carlos, what did you want to riff about?
Well, I was wondering if we could discuss whether mirrors actually know about objects that are behind pieces of paper. No, I'm joking. So, no, I mean, there's a paper by Joel. It's not a question, it's just a prompt, right? It's almost like he's treating us like some subject AI, where he wants us to complete the paper, like that's the prompt, and we have to follow up from the entire paper. So we could talk about that. There's been these questions. Where were they? Let me just actually pin them down. Was it in? There were some questions. I mean, this is ages ago. This is before we even started thinking about hypergraphs and things like that. But I found it kind of interesting, these formal systems that were expressive but not very expressive. Like, what was it called? Like, what is the name of this thing again? Calculus of indications. What is the name of this again?
I'm not even sure what
you remember, Nick? You remember the thing that has on a single symbol, basically a single unary.
I mean, like laws of form?
Laws of form. That's the term. That's the term. Yeah. So there was this discussion that came from someone mentioning these laws of form about the expressivity of systems and things like that, and obviously that was in the context of emulation of systems and so on. So I've always wondered about is this? Let me put it this way: how much of the expressive power of a formal system is in the formal system itself, or is in the combination of the formal system understood as some kind of rewrite system that has a life of its own, some kind of computational system that you can implement in some computer you can run, together with a mathematician or a human user that's somehow trying to attribute some semantics or some kind of higher meaning, right? So that to me was the interesting question that at the time. I don't think we discussed it a lot back in the day. But I think it's an interesting point, right? Like how much of the information is in the stuff and how much is in the reading of the stuff, and how should we take that as part of our considerations when designing different languages or when developing mathematical theory and things like that, because that's the kind of thing that mathematical theory has always neglected, right? Like it's almost like in physics, observers in physics, right? Like throughout history, you almost never see a systematic treatment of observers as part of physics. You just see the physics themselves, sort of like observer-centric physics, until basically Galileo or something like that, right? I want to say. So maybe this is similar. It's some kind of computational. I mean, not to sound like just observer theory, but some notion of computational observer or mathematical observer that that is instead of engaging with some abstract world of computations of Rulliat or something like that, is actually engaging with it's an actual observer, and it's engaging with some particular physical system that seems to behave computationally in certain ways. So like obviously I am engaging with this computational system that I have here, and it's clearly doing things that I interpret, and they make sense because my brain is making sense of them, right? So that's extreme, perhaps because it's some general machine that is doing general things, simulating images and all kinds of things. But in the very small cases of this, like laws of form or some very basic rewrite systems, when we say that they have limited expressive power, like I think it's interesting to reflect on whether that's, you know, our limitation in reading the system, or the system itself. I mean, obviously the system is what it is, but yeah. Anyway, that's sort of the cloud of ideas.
Well, I do have a riff on that. I mean, and just in case people are thrown off by the term observer, I mean, I think that this also could even be generalized to questions of theory design or model choice, just in terms of general methodology of science, philosophy of the science itself. I mean, so one thing that we've discussed in the past is, so you can compare two cases. So like on the one hand, you can imagine you have some theory or some model that involves some relatively elaborate object, but then the statements that you can make about that object are relatively simple. So we see this, I mean, we could raise some different examples from theoretical physics, for instance, where ultimately you have some statement that's relatively elegant, but it involves highly complicated objects. If you take something like the Langlands program, we have these things called L groups, where there's a very simple statement about passage between these L groups, but the construction of these groups is highly elaborate. So your statements are simple, and if your theory is implemented computationally, even the relations between the different components of your theory are relatively elegant and simple. But there's a high algorithmic cost that you incur when you're constructing the objects. So the construction cost is high, but then the actual computational behavior is relatively simple. On the other hand, you can imagine a scenario in which you're using a parsimonious formal system. So your construction costs are quite low, but then you have to design a rather rich interpretive framework in order to make sense of what this low level behavior actually means. So if you have some very simple formal system, and then you want to, this is like the kind of thing that maybe Stephen might try to do, where you have some very low level rewrite system, but then you want to do something like find a particle, and then presumably you'll have to define, okay, so if we're going to interpret this, physical quantity or quality in this way, we're going to interpret this in this way, we're going to interpret this in this way. And so your interpretive framework is much higher. Maybe you could call that what the observer is doing, or it's simply this kind of ontological or interpretative framework that you're introducing as well. So I have this kind of suspicion that there's no free lunch in this regard. You either have, you can either make kind of elegant statements about complicated objects, or you can make elaborate statements about very, very simple objects. That's kind of a provocation. That's my default assumption, though maybe there are some interesting exceptions to that.
Could be. Yeah, I guess that directly connects to some notion of computational reducibility, right? Where, because if you have, I mean, it seems that is true for sectors where you are in some kind of irreducible regime, right? Because if you aren't, then it's very plausible that how you choose your terms and your rules are gonna dramatically change the length. It's like, I would say that is fundamentally the case, but not necessarily always the case. Wouldn't you say, Nick, that that's what computational reducibility is talking about, more or less?
I was talking about, well, not sure. It's always kind of depends on who do you ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I could be wrong, but I think irreducibility is usually just about, the way that these formal systems behave. I've recommended for some time that try it, like in terms of doing general kind of constructivist modeling, there are different kinds of computations that come into play, or there are different kind of measures of complexity that seem appropriate. So like on the one hand, how complicated are your objects? Because you can imagine having some formal system involving certain objects. You can imagine having like a rewrite system where you have certain hypergraphs to begin with, but you have to build those. You have to have those hypergraphs ready, let's say, before you begin rewriting with them. Or if you have something where you're performing operations on some group, you would kind of make that, you could just kind of have that be a computation that runs, but first you have to define the group. So on the one hand, there's a computational burden that you incur when you construct the object to begin with. Then there's the computational, then there are things like the runtime length of if you're trying to compute with some object, how long does it take for the thing to actually compute to completion if it's a finite computation? And then now you're in the realm of computational, what's called computational complexity theory. Whereas what I was describing before is something like constructive complexity. And I don't know if that field even exists, but it's basically like if you were doing constructivism, you would try and estimate what's the computational cost of actually constructing this object. I'm not sure if that is really a field that exists yet, but it's not unlike algorithmic information theory in that.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's very close, at least in spirit, to what assembly theory is trying to do.
You mean Cronin's thing?
Yeah.
Cronin's thing? Yeah.
I think, yeah, I've been in contact with them at some point, because I realized that they were needlessly using graphs instead of hypergraphs, basically, for their. But this is just for the mathematical part. It's not so much the concept of assembly. For two reasons. I mean, one being that they were mapping. They were doing something extremely strange. It's like, I mean, how crazy? I want your opinion, guys. How crazy do you think is to be in order to model assembly, right? It's like take two things, put them together to give new things, right? And then those can be assembled with others. How crazy is it that they decide to do a graph, a directed graph to basically say, have A and B and AB as a string, and they do a graph, and then because there's a symmetry that A with B, also B with A, right? They decide to map. Or they decide to map each of the edges from A to AB. They map that to B with a edge to vertex maps to emphasize that you keep track of all the precedents that make up the assembled object, right? And this is instead of simply saying you're mapping a pair into a single object, right? I found it to be completely crazy.
Did you say something?
Yeah. I mentioned to them like why I understand what this function, because they have a function that is edges to vertices, right? Like they encode part. I mean, the assembly information is basically some directed graph with a map from edges to vertices. That's basically what they model an assembly system. And I said, why do you need like this map when you could just have something that is explicitly encoding the groups of elements that are being assembled and the output as assembled object, which is very naturally a hyperedge.
Yeah.
They were.
Well,
I mean,
were they receptive?
Yeah, Cronin considered. He said, "Yeah, that sounds right. That it's
okay."
We didn't follow up because we got very busy, like we did different things at the time, but he considered that looked right. That, you know, mathematically that seems, because somehow I was looking at it thinking, why would you make your life so complicated that you have to deal with a map from edges to vertices, like some really nasty graph theoretic object that is, you know, very awkward in conventional graph theory, when you could just, you know, increase the order of your base object and just do graph theory as usual, or hypergraph theory in a very usual way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but the reason I mentioned assembly theory is that one of the aspects that they have that I quite like, which I think is the merit of this approach, is this notion of, it's exactly what you were describing, James, is this idea that you have some sort of constructive complexity, right? It's about the, you know, the actual constructive difficulty, not the formal difficulty that algorithmic complexity measures typically. But I mean, in some regimes, I think in some regimes, these two things are equivalent. They should be, right? In some cases, these things are indistinguishable because of how, you know, what the grammar is in some sense, right? They should be almost indistinguishable or the same.
Well, actually, so the kind of setup I imagine is like, so you have some formal theory, but the formal theory itself involves some objects, and then you have some rule. Your objects are obeying that rule, and maybe at some point it has some final outcome. So there are many different forms of complexity at play. So one is, how expensive was it to get the objects that you're involving in your theory to begin with? The second question is, you know, then your objects are following some rule, and how complicated are those rules? And I would say that's algorithmic complexity, which is the description length of whatever the rule is that's being obeyed, or a set of rules that's being obeyed in your formal system. Then there's how long, if it tends towards some finite output, predictably, how long does it take to run, which would be computational complexity theory. Then there's when it is running, and you could even look at the different evaluation pathways if it admits that kind of thing. How complicated is the behavior? That's kind of Stephen's contribution, I would say, which is not just looking at the complexity of the rules and not looking at, say, the complexity of the objects involved, but not looking at the runtime, but actually looking at the behavior that happens in the middle. And this is kind of part of the motivation ultimately for what we've been working on with Carlos, which is what are the trade-offs between these. So that's something that I'm kind of interested in, which is like, you know, this general framework of designing theories or designing models where you're taking into account, you have to construct some objects. Those objects are going to obey some rules. Rules have complexity. The objects have complexity. The actual behavior has complexity, and it has a certain amount of time complexity. But then there's another thing, which is, I guess it's in part of the behavioral complexity, which is, then let's say you're supposed to interpret it some way, like, you know, you have some behaviors, and then you're assigning that to certain kinds of outcomes. Well, how complicated is that? Because if you have some very low level system, like if you're trying to model the stock market using laws of form, it's going to be very complicated, as you can imagine, right? And so then you have to say, oh yeah, when you have this particular configuration of symbols, that means you have Argentine debt crisis. When you have this particular configuration of symbols, we're going to the moon, et cetera, et cetera. So that's yet another layer on this, which is kind of the ontological or interpretive complexity of this. So there are many of these, and my own suspicion is that there's no free lunch, but there's probably some kind of trade-off, where if the objects are more elaborate, the interpretive complexity is lower. It could also mean that the behavior is simpler, but the rules might have to be more complicated. And so trying to understand these trade-offs is something that I've been interested in for some time.
Can it be all described like a generalization of this complexity theory, right? You usually consider time and space complexity, how they scale with your input, linearly, exponentially, whatever. Here you kind of adding additional rural complexity or constructional, how many things you have to consider when you do some computation, or maybe when some kind of information have to be integrated in your computation, in addition to just using some space and time, computational time, right?
Yeah, I think it would take space-time complexity, both of which are computational complexity theory, and then you would add in rule complexity is basically, I would say that's basically Chaitin and Solomonov and algorithmic information theory. And then you would add in kind of behavioral complexity, which is basically kind of Wolfram, like maybe Stevens kind of brand of complexity. And then you'd add in constructive complexity, which I guess is something that is also something in assembly theory. And then there'd be one other one, which is this thing that Carlos raised at the beginning, which is, or was kind of inspired by what Carlos was raising in the beginning, which is, does your choice of your underlying model, underlying formalism, does it make your interpretative framework more or less complicated? And I think it does. To the standard model with trying to find particles in cellular automata knows the difference between, the interpretative burden that's imposed depending on the underlying formal system that you're using. And yeah, it would be very interesting. And then, if it turns out that these things are more or less equivalent, you're just swapping between these different forms of complexity, then it raises very interesting questions about what's a better or a worse model in the sciences. Because there's often this notion, everything from Occam's razor to, parsimonious model choice, there might be an argument that there really is no such thing as parsimony. It's just kind of an accounting trick where you're pushing these different forms of complexity into specific specific compartments where yes, the behavior is simple, but your objects are very complicated, or your rules are very complicated, or everything is simple, but then your interpretive framework is very complicated. And so then it becomes more just a matter of, maybe this is where this observer thing comes in, where basically you're just trying to create theories that we can understand. trying to balance these so that we can actually make good use of them, given our own human computational faculties. Maybe there's like a kind of a good ratio or an envelope where the rules can only be so complicated, the objects can only be so complicated, our interpretive framework can only be so complicated, and it's not that they're parsimonious, it's just that we strike a good balance, which makes these things particularly easy for people to use. And it could be different for different forms of AIs, et cetera, where you can reallocate complexity, and they can handle it. So it's kind of an interesting prospect.
For sure, yeah. Where's Wukash?
I don't know. Wukash is his internet. I imagine his internet died. There he is.
So we have a couple of comments here. Well, memes of distraction always around, always welcome.
No, hey memes.
And
MOD.
Let me unpack this. Mirables? I don't know how to pronounce the name. Mirables? I don't know. Sounds kind of letting the. So maybe I'll just read it. Wait, but that was a response to the previous one. No, that was a question to the assembly theory thing. So yeah, I think the question is whether the map was to ensure the directedness, but yes, it was actually to ensure the symmetry of the assembly, answering to the question. And then I would say packing the complexity into constructions and letting the derivations behavior be complicated is preferable.
Well,
letting the derivations be simple. Yeah, so packing the complexity into constructions and letting the derivations and behavior be simple is preferable. That's what they said.
Well, that's kind of how pure mathematics often works. which is the learning curve is steep. The technical debt involved in the objects is significant. But then once you understand those objects, then you climb to the top of the mountain and you have this nice view, and then the statements you can make about these objects are really quite simple. So that is generally how mathematics does work. But then the question is, I mean, yeah, I'm open to the question of whether or not you lose anything when you do it that way. I mean, one thing that you lose is you lose people's attention because not everyone's going to learn these complicated objects. But then the question is, okay, then if you were to reallocate complexity somewhere else, it's a significant amount of complexity to reallocate. And then it'll be, okay, yeah, the objects are simple, but the interpretive framework is really complicated, or the behavior is utterly chaotic. So this is the kind of the I think if there is no free lunch, once you consider all these different forms of complexity, I think mathematics is a particular instance of a kind of a allocation of these that is human friendly, or at least friendly to some humans. The question is, are there others? And it's not clear yet. I mean, we know formal systems have been used for certain kinds of models. I know that's something that Stephen is interested in. But my fear is that the interpretive framework is going to be quite severe, where it's like, yes, we have a graph rewriting or we have cellular automata, but then there's like 10 pages of, if you have this little pattern, then this suggests we're going to interpret this as spin, we're going to interpret this as energy, we're going to interpret this as this, we're going to interpret this. So then the behavior is non-trivial. The rules are very simple. So like, Chaitin complexity is very low, but then your kind of interpretive complexity will be elaborate. You would need like a whole manual for understanding what little subtle behaviors in your graph or in your CA kind of correspond to once you get up to complicated physical theories. Though, I guess the point is you could always integrate that into software. And so rather than have some complicated manual that's explaining where you have to refer to it, you could have something where even the computer itself is interpreting it. That would be an interesting thing where you have some say, model of physics with very low Chaitin complexity, but then your computer, as a kind of post-processing, is able to kind of identify like, okay, this looks like, it looks like we've constructed this, or it looks like this obeys this process. If you can delegate some of that to the machine, then you can delegate some of the interpretative labor to the machine. That in principle could work. But yeah, this is kind of not to be grand or anything, but I think this is kind of a way of looking at science in general. Is there's complexity at play in science, and I think that creating models and theories is a kind of just a matter of design choices where you're trying to prevent too much complexity in different areas. And we've tended to prefer the objects to be complex, the behavior not to be too complicated, and the time complexity to be tractable whenever possible.
Yeah, I agree. That's the level. So, any further thoughts, Nick or Łukasz? Because we are coming to the 30-minute mark.
No?
In that case, we could close it and then move on to the roundtable. So,
Łukasz, you sure you don't have anything about?
imagine
Because I know I just want to give a shout out to I'll give Łukasz. I'll give you a.
I've been thinking of this thing for quite some time, and it just begs for some precise quantitative definition of this entropy or complexity or whatever, but I have no idea how to even approach it.
Well,
because all the definitions that we already have are too specific, right?
Well, this is in part what Carlos's work is Carlos's work is aiming towards this, where at least in part it could help to partially resolve it. But actually, Łukasz, I was going to set you up and like one thing that Łukasz, I know you're interested, for instance, in kind of the future prospect of doing increasingly sophisticated math with computers, for instance, and like this question of like can computers construct or discover new mathematical objects or this kind of thing. So I think one thing that we'll probably encounter as we work on that kind of thing is this like constructivist complexity, like what is actually involved in fashioning new mathematical objects, but also exhaustively, like how hard is it to find new mathematical objects if you just set out to do so. So I thought, I don't know, Łukasz, do you have any comments on, because mathematics is kind of a known instance of kind of allocating between these different forms of complexity that we're just describing in kind of a sketchy form.
Yeah, but
What do you think? Yeah.
Yes, I was talking, at least to you. I don't remember if we had some general discussion on a public forum about this formal system, but about this like artificial mathematician that they want to do, right? It's basically the system for allocating complexity into the definitions. That if I like, I'm now thinking, how did it like, right? Because you look at the definitions that let you do the most of things quickly. So you're basically searching for definitions that pack a lot of complexity in them.
But the definitions themselves are relatively simple, right?
Not necessary, but if you have like the whole tower of definitions one over the other, you do it step by step, but at every step, yeah, the definition is. You could go the other way, but I wouldn't call it mathematics, maybe. Like it's not what usual human mathematics look like.
What do you mean? What do you mean by go the other way?
Or all the ways. Basically, you could look at all the rules and all mathematical space and try to exhaust this. Basically, all possible definitions or possible proofs and theorems and so on.
Yeah, you see, this is what I wonder, which is like, could basic things like vector spaces or Galois groups or differential forms, like could a machine just find these by, some like combinatorial exhaustive procedure? Like, would there be some way to just enumerate all kinds of random mathematical objects and then find like, the zeta function, yeah, this will be helpful. Or,
I mean,
a Riemann surface, this will be helpful. I mean,
if you start from arithmetic and geometry and maybe some sort of set theory, then you'll get to something like topological space eventually. I think just machine searching for it.
What, Carlos, what's your take on this? Like, do you think that the most useful mathematical objects used in pure math today, do you think that, if you had some procedure, like if you had a supercomputer or something, and it was easy to kind of just combinatorially fashion random objects together, you think that you could eventually come up with some general procedure for identifying which ones seem promising and which ones seem kind of useless?
I mean, what I think is that, these are human judgments on these objects, right? So in some sense, the machine is not going to know unless we actually tell the machine what to look for. in which case we're
Yeah.
kind of not.
No, but
I'm a bit confused about the question
I
because
propose basically looking for things that pack a lot of information. So we generate, let's say, definitions or objects or proofs, like in some sort. And let's say you generated like 10,000 of possible definitions of some objects, and now you want to use it and study their properties. Maybe there are 3 definitions in this 10,000 that you can easily infer something interesting about.
I think this is actually very related.
And then you keep these definitions.
Yeah.
And later you mix in these definitions with the other that already exist, and you look for other definitions and so on. And
Sure. I think this is very similar to where the conversation, if you remember, Nick, yesterday, where the conversation led to in the end, where we were talking about, because essentially in that context it was very special about hypergraph rewrite systems and this kind of particular context. But in a way, hypergraph rewrite systems, as I have tried to put forward for some time now, they model generally these situations of like general formal systems or general mathematical objects. So yeah, that's the game, right? Like that's the big question. And you want to set up your kind of constellation of possibilities and run the system. And I think that the difficulty, as I said, I mean, I do go back to my previous comment, is that what the human input here is first input is to create the system that is going to generate this kind of stuff that is
It's non-trivial.
our work, our labor as we go on. That's what we're doing. But the other thing, which is the crucial one, is you have to ask the questions to actually detect what's going on in there, right? Because you say interesting, and it's very easy to say interesting, but what does that mean, right? Like interesting.
Exactly.
Interesting has to be given meaning, and that meaning needs to be as operational as checking identity of expressions and things like that.
Yes, I think that's the challenge, which is do we understand, even like say anthropologically, when we find a particular mathematical object to be, say, useful, interesting is somewhat of that's not really a helpful term. Maybe something like useful. Do we really understand what it means for a mathematical object to be useful? And you could go across different areas of math. Why do certain objects appear, quite often, say in mainstream mathematics? Do they share some common property? Are there kind of common criteria that they satisfy that you could instruct a machine to go find or not? And I don't think we have kind of a general criteria of what it means for a mathematical object to be useful. If we did, then we could train machines to try and find them, but I don't think we have them at the moment.
Well,
so I agree with Carlos.
So, Łukasz, you were about to say something, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would define the property of being mathematically interesting as basically having a lot of properties and relations to other already existing objects, and simple definition. That's what we usually mean by interesting. We have this structure that we can define, we can understand, and then it has many unexpected connections to other things. Like then we could program a computer to look for such structures, and there will be, like, by definition, things that it finds will be interesting.
Yeah, that's. It sounds simple, but it's not simple at all.
Yeah, it's not. But the other thing will be the interpretation of what it actually produced. Like reading a paper with just calculations or anything like. Yeah. Definition, theorem proof, but even much less human.
Yeah, I would add something else to what James was saying, and then maybe we should transition probably because we are getting a bit over time. But there's one criterion of usefulness in mathematics that is more or less parsimonious and is more or less uncontended as the one to rule them all. And it's not me trying to put it forward, but it's kind of obvious, which is science, right? Like if you can do good science with it, then it's useful mathematics. And don't get me wrong, don't think of applied mathematics or something like that. Think more in terms of if you can do a science about these objects, and the science can, like, it could be a formal science, it could be a computational science, it could be something that is very much abstract in some sense. It's not doing experiments or trying to solve some concrete problem that humans have. But if you can do a science about it, so some kind of scientific industry with these mathematical objects, I'm not saying this is the right definition, but that's certainly a very obvious choice of a definition of usefulness, because at the end of the day, you're going to look at an object. I mean, what do mathematical objects do? I mean, they model stuff, right? They capture ideas and they operate, and you can read off. It's like I always go back to the same example, 1 + 1, right? Like you look at one object, another object, it's like I have the imprint of two objects together, and I have the algebraic operation 1 + 1, and I can correlate these two, and that's why arithmetic is so powerful, and that's why it's everywhere, and we're doing it millions and millions and millions and millions of times per second all day, right? Because it actually reflects something very deeply true about our interaction with the world. So I'm not saying that's the end of the question by any means, but there is some kind of canonical choice of what constitutes a useful mathematical object, and it's not some sort of shaded kind of old-fashioned, if it's useful for science and so on.
Yeah.
But it's more about if you can do a scientific industry around it and you can articulate, then it's probably a useful mathematical. And again, this is a judgment. It's not a criterion. It's just a judgment, right?
Not just science, but also art. So
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not
Yeah.
like simple linear. You have to put it at least at like two-dimensional scale, art versus science, and where your concept lies. And
Yeah.
it should be at the lower corner when it's not artistic and science. I'm not saying to, but somewhere on the right at least.
I completely agree. And when I said, yeah, I actually completely agree. And in fact, we often have these kinds of discussions of, science and art belong in some kind of spectrum where the difference is not so much the method, because I don't think there's so much a difference in method. There's a difference in motivation. There's a difference in sort of seeked or experience that you are after, or in both activities. But I think methodologically, especially in certain kinds of art, I mean, art is extremely general, and that gets very blurry. But in certain kinds of art, it is almost indistinguishable from science in the sense that you have a set medium that you have to exploit to search for certain experiences that you want to find. That's almost like proving theorems, right? I mean, if you want to compose, you have a piece of music. It's very easy to make the analogy because you have a piece of music and you have discrete notes, and maybe it's discretized in time because you want to be rhythmically rigid or whatever, right? Then finding a particular piece, it's almost like finding a theorem, in the sense that when that piece exists, you get an emotion or some reaction or some kind of qualitative experience of it. The method to get there could be as systematic as science, right? And obviously, instead of relying on the intersubjectivity of counting or something that is very, undebatable, you rely more on, cultural dependencies and feelings and whatnot, which is much more, fluffy and indeterminate. But at the end of the day, I think the activity is quite similar. So I think I love your comment, Nick, because absolutely you have to put things on a two-dimensional plane where they belong in the same kind of activity, for sure.
I'll make one other comment, which is, at least like if you take some of the work we're doing on Langlands, some of the most important objects. So I mean, you can imagine you can propose all kinds of different mathematical objects, and I think as both Carlos and Łukasz had suggested, the importance of the object will be brought to bear in its interaction with other kinds of objects. And I think the most interesting ones that we found are objects that they certainly interact with other objects, or they're formed or yielded under some operation or some sort of mapping or some function of some kind. And they usually obey certain kinds of qualities, like you do something with the object and the object survives in some form. It doesn't just completely blow up. You do something with the object, and not only does it survive, but as you're working with the object, you're able to distill some sort of invariant or some sort of kind of distilled data that you want, and then you can discard other kind of extraneous information that you don't need, and you get exactly the thing that you were looking for, which is not unlike a kind of a controlled experiment. So this thing behind me, for instance, is an eigenform, and that's an example of something that is it's an eigenvector under this certain kind of operators, and when you get the eigenvalues, they're actually very helpful for estimating the number of solutions to polynomials over different number fields, for instance. I would say make a similar case about Galois theory and the ability to kind of extract very important information and kind of discard everything else. So mathematical objects have to kind of survive in their environment when they're acted upon, and you have to be able to harvest the kind of the nectar that you are really looking for. Now, I would say that this happens in like the arts too, where you have a particular, say, piece of cinema that comes out at just the right time, and it happens to capture something, say, in the zeitgeist that is culturally quite rich, and it was able to kind of distill it in some way that really kind of strikes a chord with a large number of people. So I think that there's to kind of to just riff on what Carlos had suggested. I think that useful mathematical objects or beautiful pieces of art, they're able to kind of capture something rich, either a sentiment or some piece of data that you're looking for, in the same way that you would do in a scientific experiment, where you isolate some relationship, and much of the other noise is removed. But that removal of the noise is really a matter of the relationship between the object and its environment. You try and control it in an experiment. In mathematics, you try and produce the right definition so that your object, when it's acted upon, it survives or it changes, but it gives you something that you're looking for in particular. And in art, the world's a very complicated place, but if you're able to produce something that kind of, you're in the theater, or you're at a museum, or you're listening to some piece of music, and kind of modulo, everyday life, you're able to identify something key about suffering, or about compassion, or about freedom, or something of this kind, then I think that's a kind of a general criteria of in math, it's usefulness. In art, it's expressiveness. It has different forms, but I think it's can you extract some nectar and kind of blur out everything else, at least for some short period of time.
Yep, I agree. That's a good note to end. So should we restart for the round?
Sure. I guess just for the sake of for the recordings on YouTube.
Yes.
Okay. What time is it? Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'll see you back here in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
See you, everyone.